I've been asked to open up the panel on calculated nostalgia, something that I am deeply invested in. This is a small portion of my home, which is the permanent ephemera collection at the museum in the Ewen Library, which I inhabit. Just to let you know that I'm a collector of stuff. The buying and selling of nostalgia has become a sort of characteristic aspect of our consumer culture. And to a certain extent, nostalgia for something real and material has become intertwined with the culture of disposability, which our economic system depends upon so heavily. What's important for us to remember is that the term nostalgia was first coined in the 17th century by a Swiss physician, and it was a description of a medical disease. This is true. Steve wanted me to link it with the disease known as melancholia, which was first named in antiquity by the founder of medicine, Hippocrates. But nostalgia was a disease that was contracted initially by Swiss mercenary soldiers who were fighting in Italy and in France, and who dislocated from their known lands and their known environments and their familiar environments, came down with an often fatal disease. Later, this disease was described as something that afflicted English sailors, as along with the expansion of British colonialism. That is to say, colonialism took people out of their conventional environs and sort of placed them, in this case at sea, on behalf of the king or the queen. And it was also a common diagnosis during the Civil War, where locals, where people who lived in a world of familiars found themselves moving not only into battlefields, but beyond the familiar. One Civil War veteran described nostalgia's effects in 1866. He said, and I quote, "It fastens upon the breast of its prey and sucks vampire-like the breath from his nostrils. Many a heroic spirit, after braving death at the cannon's mouth, has at length succumbed unresistingly to this vampire, nostalgia." The only known cure for nostalgia was for soldiers to be discharged and sent home. This is a illustration from Harper's Weekly about nostalgia during the Civil War. By the early 20th century, it moved from being a medical diagnosis to being a psychiatric diagnosis, something that afflicted in particular immigrants who were coming into the United States in droves. By 1920, half of the population of the United States were either immigrants or children of immigrants. So this was one nostalgic country. It was also, among upper-class circles, a disease that afflicted first-year boarding school students. What's important is that the roots of the idea of nostalgia was a serious, degenerative, often fatal malady caused by dislocation from a physical and geographic place of origin. Today, nostalgia, particularly as it intersects with the marketplace, and of course what doesn't, is more often a kind of wistfulness for some place we have never been, something we have never known. In a world of strangers and ephemera, it is a quest for an increasingly elusive sense of groundedness. We are looking to be grounded, and it's a hopeless quest. It is used in a calculated way, and it is an appeal to something that people feel is missing from their everyday lives or from themselves. It is an ineffable sense of discontent. I want to show you a little video clip from a workshop on design packaging dealing specifically with the packaging of nostalgia. This is, the words are being spoken by Rick Barrick, a branding expert who runs an agency called CBX. And he talks about the thinking behind nostalgia-oriented package design.
Why do brands use nostalgia as part of their packaging strategy? The good old days of personal relationships with your community corner store or local store owner are a thing of the past, an era gone by. And so too is the relationship one had with a local store clerk or a pharmacist, so willing to serve you that homemade root beer while you wait for grandma's century-old elixir recipe for Dandy Boy's cough. Consumers today are hard-pressed to find these relationships. There's no longer a face behind the stores we visit or the products we buy. And in the era of big box retailers, franchises, nationwide chains, consumers have been left with an emotional gap in the products they purchase and intertwine into their daily lives. While retailers have built strategies to connect better with their shoppers, for example, fulfilling needs through local and regional offerings, most brands are left to their own devices at establishing and nurturing personal relationships with their consumers. While there are many ways for a brand to establish a relationship, a number of brands today look to nostalgia as one of the ways they can bridge the gap between an era gone by and the marketplace of today. Thus, it's one way for a brand to build credibility and establish trust and convey quality to its audience.
The word that got cut off was audience. The question remains, I mean, this is a very undynamic description of thinking about using nostalgia as a marketing device. But the question remains, how can we more fully understand and situate the emotional gap that this guy is talking about? And what is it about our lives that makes an artificial past so alluring and yet at the same time so fundamentally unsatisfying? Because after all, if we were satisfied, we wouldn't be moving on to the next nostalgic item. And to some extent, one of the most perceptive analysts of this gap was a guy who I have written extensively about in a couple of books, named Walter Lippmann, arguably the most influential American intellectual of the 20th century. In 1922, he wrote a book called Public Opinion, which some of you may have read. It should be on the curriculum of certainly the Design Crit program, because in it he really talks about what public opinion is and what are the sort of mechanisms by which people perceive their world. Lippmann explored the sources of human perception in a cosmopolitan world where people increasingly did not occupy a world of familiars, but were part of a social environment that was in continual flux and that extended beyond their cognitive or emotional reach. That is to say, they were living in this world where there was what had become common was the intercommunication of thought without the need for bodily presence. Now, we like that. It's good. We go on the internet. We use telephones. We don't really have a problem with this. but in certain ways his argument was that in a situation where there is such a vast world beyond our immediate ability to receive it, that the real environment was altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting for direct acquaintance. Although we have to act in that environment, we have to reconstruct it on a simpler model before we can manage with it. At the level of social life, what is called the adjustment of man to his environment takes place through the medium of fictions. He didn't talk about nostalgia. He talked about fictions like pseudo-environments or pictures in our head. But he might as well have been talking about nostalgia, thoughts about the past. These are located at the intersection between our particular emotional requirements and the historical circumstances of our lives. In other words, we have certain kinds of needs, and yet the historical circumstances which make that world of ours seem so far away requires us to make constructions. Freud called this process, sorry to get theoretical here, as long as they're talking in bubbles, right? Freud called this process object cathexis. Basically, what he was saying is that each one of us, our egos, are filled with holes, are filled with a sense of aspects of ourselves that are missing. And he said that in projecting desire onto another person or an object or an image, people are unconsciously attempting to compensate for something that they see missing from their own sense of themselves. In the dream of achieving wholeness again, people's imagined pasts, among other objects of desire, become the repository or become the compensation for this sense of loss. I have to acknowledge that this is a kind of editing together of Freud and me. In a consumer culture where things come from and where they go remains largely invisible, this contributes even further to a sense of isolation from the cycles of life that were, in the past, for most people, not long ago, familiar. The digitalization of our perceptual environment, which is quite amazing, also adds to this sense of loss, of bereavement. This is a cartoon that I downloaded without getting any rights about connectedness and the way in which connectedness, there's a big piece in the Times by Sherry Turkle about the end of conversation recently. This is not something brand new. So, in the calculated nostalgias of our life, this issue of the loss of something is both emphasized and, at least symbolically, it's responded to. I want to close today with a short example of what I would call calculated, or what the conference is called calculated nostalgia.
People don't make a list of websites they want to see before they die. They don't fill photo albums with pictures from an online search. Like being there is not like being there. It's okay. The internet will be just fine without you. That's why we built the Dodge Journey. It has everything you need to get out there. Somewhere. Anywhere. Think of it as a search engine for the worldwide world.
Well, my timer just went off, so I made it.